So welcome everybody once again to our seminar organized by Abstraction. And we have the pleasure also today to host a seminar with a speaker that we have already seen this week. Is Professor Tony Veale from University College Dublin. And today our seminar today is from remote. We are all from remote because of the weather alert issued by the University of Bologna. So I will keep my introduction very short because in the previous seminar held on Monday, I had a 5-minute introduction of Professor Tony Veale, who is Professor of Computer Sciences in Dublin. And we are very, very happy to have him. He is also member of the advisory board of the Abstraction project. And in this week, we have been meeting with him and exchanging ideas and feedback on ongoing projects and thinking about further collaborations. So without any further ado, I would let the floor to Tony for this second seminar. And Tony, the word is yours. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks everyone for coming along today. So I'm going to talk about irony and analogy. So let me just quickly say, or try to define what an irony is, because we all have broader personal definitions and it's a very flexible concept, somewhat diffuse. So I take irony to be this conflict between the propositional content of an utterance and the propositional attitude, or our attitude to that content. So it's not the case that when we're ironic, we're saying one thing and meaning the opposite. That's lying, really. With irony, we're often sincere on the facts, but we're insincere in our attitude to the facts that we are communicating. So we say that something is a good thing when in fact we think it's a bad thing, or we say that something is a good comparison when in fact we mean that it's a poor comparison and a better contrast. And that's what applies in the case of analogies. In an ironic analogy, we make a comparison that's actually a profoundly flawed comparison. We're really enticing the audience to treat it as a contrast, to take different meaning than the superficial positive meaning that might appear. Okay, so irony and sarcasm get mixed up quite a bit. Sarcasm literally means to cut flesh. It's a biting phenomenon. It thrives on its obviousness. There's a certain demeanor and voice, eye rolling and so forth that accompanies sarcasm. And generally, there's little doubt that people are speaking sarcastically. In that case, it is sometimes the situation that we flip both the propositional attitude and the propositional content. So we literally say things like, that's great, that's wonderful, oh super, when we mean, oh that's terrible, how dreadful. Now, because sarcasm is more obvious, it should be easier to detect. And that certainly is the case. Irony thrives on subtlety, and it creates an ambiguity that even experienced speakers and ironic speakers can have trouble navigating. So lots of computational work has been spent on focusing on sarcasm. Now, sarcasm is interesting computationally because it's a very complex phenomenon linguistically, but it's also very relevant commercially because there's so much content that is collected from the web and automatically processed by large companies to do review analysis and so forth, to try to do sentiment mining. And if someone is sarcastic or ironic, then the superficial sentiment of the text is actually quite different than the intended sentiment. And this is especially true in social media, and especially Twitter, X, where the posts are so small. It's really hard to figure out what the sentiment is unless you look at the prior context of an interaction. And back in 2017, my student, Annie Rudagosh, and myself, we started looking at neural models. And I think Annie built one of the very first neural approaches to sarcasm detection. And it had all of the usual suspects. word embeddings, convolution layers, LSTMs. He threw everything at it. And neural frameworks encourage you to throw everything at these things. Try to get that extra 1 or 2% of performance. But we found that the best performance enhancement for classifying a tweet as sarcastic or not was to include a representation of the prior conversation that led up to the current tweet. Because if the instigating tweet is such that it encourages a sarcastic response, we need to know that. So we have in the context input a representation of the previous inciting tweet. And we also used a sentiment analysis of the writer's past 100 tweets to try to capture their recent mood. The idea being that if they're snarky or angry, then they're more likely to be sarcastic than if they were upbeat and positive and tuned in and so forth. And we found that both of those additions improved the model's performance significantly, but that they were not additive improvements, that they both did, in some ways, both the same thing, and when you put them both together, you didn't get twice the improvement. So that was quite an interesting task. Labeling the data was a challenge, because looking at these tweets out of context, months after they were generated by their original authors, and trying to discern the author's original intent is quite difficult. So Annie came up with an interesting approach where an automated system would contact the authors directly and ask them, were you being ironic? Were you being sarcastic when you wrote this? And so we got the authors to annotate their own tweets, which I think was the first, which lends the data a certain authenticity that you don't get when you have groups of annotators labeling other people's tweets. Okay, so as I said, we threw everything at the model, and the purpose was simply to classify or to make a binary decision as to whether a tweet was sarcastic or not. But what does it mean to be sarcastic or ironic? And I'm going to start being specific about irony here now. I proposed a very simple symbolic model some years ago, which I called EPIC. The idea being that you fail to get the sarcastic or ironic intent of an utterance. It's an epic fail. So epic means the expected value of a property of an instance of a concept. So we represent in epic our set of expectations as 4 tuples. So we have the expected value of a given property of a given instance of a given concept. The whole idea behind irony, of course, is that it plays with our expectations. We expect positivity, but we get hidden negativity. So for a certain property P, our expectation will be that for instances of concept C, P will be high valence. For instance, we expect parties to be fun and enjoyable, interesting. So P being interesting has a high valence. But in the context of our ironic utterance, where we're communicating our dismay and disappointment at that failure of expectation, P should have a low valence. So an ironic utterance sends our expectation of a property plummeting. So we have to model what those expectations are before we can identify the plummeting of that property. So I'll give you an example, and here's an example from an utterance that was generated by an AI. Not a very sophisticated AI, but an AI nonetheless. An AI from the era before large language models, so a symbolic approach back in 2017. So we had, prior to Elon Musk taking over and ruining Twitter, we did a lot of work with Twitter bots. And one of my focal Twitter bots was Metaphor Magnet, or Metaphor is My Business, and it generated metaphors. It was a metaphor generator. And one of the things that we looked at was the generation of irony or ironic comparisons. And here's an example output from Metaphor is My Business. the bot doesn't work anymore because bots have all collapsed in the age of X with the new X API. So hashtag irony, when some hosts arrange entertaining parties the way presenters arrange boring lectures. Now you'll notice that the irony is framed in a number of ways here. First off, it's explicitly tagged as hashtag irony. This is a social media phenomenon. People don't actually do this in real life. They don't actually tag their ironic utterances as irony in a conversation. They don't say, ironically speaking, blah, blah, blah. The whole point of irony is that you have to discern it for yourself. But on social media, the possibility of being shamed is so strong, so destructive that people preemptively tag their content as sarcastic or ironic. So that's what we did here. The Twitter bot says hashtag irony, I'm being ironic. The second framing device it uses is it puts scare quotes around the word entertaining. And that means that we should take this word with a certain skepticism. It doesn't mean what we think it means in this context. That's what scare quotes generally do. They draw our attention to something, say, I require special treatment. And here, entertaining doesn't mean typically entertaining. It refers to the expectation of entertainment that has been thwarted by this poor party, let's say. And the third framing device is that there is a structural or relational analogy at work here. So the idea that hosts arrange entertaining parties is analogically mapped to the idea that presenters arrange boring lectures. Okay, so our expectation that lectures will be long and dry and boring is put into juxtaposition with our expectation that parties should be fun and entertaining. So we've got three structural framing devices here. So the computer has generated this using the EPIC model, and it's framed its output so that we get the irony. In fact, it's hitting us over the head with a big rubber hammer saying, hey, I'm ironic. But it's interesting to ask ourselves, how effective are these framing devices? So let's look at this EPIC model in context. We expect the word entertaining to have a high valence. And if we were to ask people to judge the word in a null context and assign a valence between +1 and -1, we'd expect that it would have a valence quite close to +1. So just asking people in a crowdsourced environment to associate a valence, a positivity score, if you will, with this word will give us a valence of 0.8, 0.85. That's in a null context. That means there's no sentence, there's no situation in which the word is being used. Now, we expect that when the word is used ironically, that valence will fall. So in the context of our ironic statement, the word entertaining, which is the focal word of the comparison, and that's why it's in scare quotes, drops significantly in terms of its valence. So if we ask people, again, in a crowdsourced setting, what is the valence of the word entertaining in this context, we should expect a much lower score. And if we aggregate the scores across all of the crowd workers, for all of the examples, for all of the focal words that we're interested in, and this drop in valence we refer to as the downshift. So we've operationalized irony as a downshift in valence in context from our prior expectations to our realization in context. And the bigger the downshift, then the more effective the ironic utterance is at communicating an ironic stance. And the smaller the downshift, the less effective it is. So now we can begin to tease apart the different framing strategies and ask which of these framing strategies achieve the greatest downshift in context, which is what we want people to have, right? We want them to feel this deflation of expectations. That's what irony is all about. It's deflating expectations, and there's a certain ennui that goes with that. So we tease apart the different framing devices by having different formulations of the utterance. So the base formulation we simply express the proposition without any adornments. So some hosts arrange entertaining parties. By the way, I'm focusing here in my example on a single example, but when we do the crowdsourcing, we use 80 examples that have been generated by the machine and chosen at random by the machine. We don't choose the data ourselves. We get the machine to generate 80 different ironic utterances. And then we look at these variants of the formulation. So the base formulation, we simply state the underlying proposition. The comparative or analogical condition, we place it into analogical alignment with an opposing situation. So here, hosts arrange entertaining parties, lecturers present boring presentations. In the quoted condition, we put the focal word in scare quotes. Some hosts arrange entertaining parties. And in the hashtag condition, we prefix it with the hashtag irony to say we're being ironic. You think this is pretty heavy-handed, but it's surprising how ineffectual this is. In the quote plus comparison condition, we use both scare quotes and analogy. And in the trifecta, we use the hashtagging of irony plus the scare quotes plus the analogy. And that's what we saw actually tweeted by the Twitter bot. But we give these variants to different crowd workers and we ask them to judge the valence of the focal word, in this case, entertaining, in each context. And we can then judge the extent to which a downshift is achieved by different framing devices. And it turns out, when we crunch the numbers, that the explicit marking of irony is not at all effective. It doesn't actually achieve a statistically significant downshift, which you might think is surprising. I'm telling you I'm being ironic, but the actual effect of irony is not being experienced. And I think that's because the word irony on social media has become utterly bleached. It doesn't really mean anything. It just means I have an attitude. And I hope you have an attitude too. It's not actually operationalized in any significant way. And the word is bandied about too often by people who perhaps don't know what it means. So that sounds a little elitist, doesn't it? People define what words mean. But generally, the word has been stretched and attenuated in social media to the point that on social media it doesn't really have a meaning anymore, I think. But the other framing criteria are quite effective. Scare quoting, for instance, achieves on average a 10% or a 10-point downshift. That's a significant observation. And the analogical comparison achieves a 22-point downshift on average across all of our examples. And that's also statistically significant. And those two effects are additive. So when we have scare quoting plus the analogical framing, we get on average a 31-point downshift across our 80 examples. So it's quite interesting, we found that you can encourage in generated outputs an ironic reading with very simple, somewhat superficial framing devices. Scare quoting is the easiest thing to do, just put scare quotes around a focal word. But the interesting thing for us in the context of this lecture is that analogy, or contrastive analogy, if you will, is effective at inducing an ironic effect. And that's really what I want to look at here today. Now, this work we did back in 2015, and it was done with my postdoc at the time, Alessandro Valatutti, and he did all of the number crunching. It was based on the symbolic generation of ironic utterances. But we live in the age of large language models. So let's look at how large language models handle ironic generation and whether they're up to the task of being ironic on demand. Now, we saw a certain simplified form of relational analogy in the examples I've just discussed. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to look at an even simpler form of analogy, which is sometimes called the XYZ construct in cognitive linguistics. And the XYZ construct is a partial proportional analogy. So for instance, here's an example that was generated by GPT 3.5 to be an ironic analogy. Donald Trump is the Albert Einstein of diplomacy. So Donald Trump is the X. He's been compared to Y, Albert Einstein, and he's been placed into the domain Z, diplomacy. Implicit in the analogy is the missing domain, the domain of Albert Einstein, which we might call theoretical physics. There's a little flexibility here. So Donald is to Albert as theoretical physics is to diplomacy. So you can see the proportional analogy hiding behind the XYZ. XYZs are really interesting to me for a number of reasons. One, because they're such a compact form of analogy. They're analogies in a nutshell. So they're very concise and elegant. They're also easy to collect. Now, of course, there are lots of XYZ constructs, such as Macron is the president of France, Rome is the capital of Italy, that aren't at all figurative. What makes this construct figurative is that Albert Einstein is an individual in this instance. He's not a class, right? But he's being treated as a class by the XYZ. So we imagine that there's an Albert Einstein of physics, an Albert Einstein of diplomacy, an Albert Einstein of cooking, an Albert Einstein of literature, and so forth. So he's a class of individuals. And we imagine that those individuals are very clever, very charismatic, very iconoclastic in their way. So we can identify these XYZs automatically on the web because the Y is an individual being treated as a class. So, and in this case, it's a proper named individual. So we can identify the individuality of the Y and extract them quite easily. And that's what I did 12 years ago now for my book, Exploding the Creativity Myth. I have a chapter when I discuss XYZ constructs. And back then, I used Google and a little technique called Google milking to just basically harass the search engine automatically with search queries, with wildcards to try to find as many XYZs as I could from the web. And we collected a corpus of 2,196. So we got a lot more XYZs than that, but 2196 were the figurative subset of the data that we collected. So we had lots of comparisons about George Bush and Bill Gates and Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, so Barack Obama, Vladimir Putin. And in fact, here's a summary of the data. So I think he's a dusty figure of the past now, but the most common X was Ron Paul. And the second most common was Ann Coulter, and somewhat rabid right-wing commentator. Barack Obama, he had been president for 4 years. Bill Clinton, Sarah Palin, John McCain, Mitt Romney, Barack Obama's opponent in the 2012 election. Rush Limbaugh, dead now. Joe Biden, sorry, and so on. So a lot of these people are still around. Rupert Murdoch. The most common Y, the most common comparator was Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris, I think, is still around, but he doesn't have the cultural currency he had in 2012 when everyone was making Chuck Norris jokes. Basically, to be compared to Chuck Norris was to be said to be tough, durable, but very dumb. So very unsophisticated. So if you were the Chuck Norris of acting, you might be, I don't know, Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? Just reliable and durable, but don't go asking any profound philosophical questions. Michael Jordan was the top of his sports field. So any sportsman who was the top of their field, a sportswoman, would be compared to Michael Jordan. Donald Trump was a businessman in 2012, a somewhat shady businessman, so that was the comparison there. And the most frequent domain that was cited in those XYZs was the 21st century. So Lots of XYZs are temporal. They compare figures from now to figures from the past. But we also see the NFL, so that's the National Football League. So people were talking about football stars or the Republican Party or the National Baseball Association or the left or the internet or the Democrats or Philippines. Philippines is quite a common one. Manny Pacquiao was also a common X. So this is what the data looked like. Now, there were some surprising features of this data. For instance, quite a lot of the data, quite a lot of the X's were male. The vast majority of them were male. That is, the people on the internet were using XYZs to talk predominantly about male figures in the news or in culture. And that may be a fixation, that may be a symptom of our culture, but it seems quite unlikely that if you were to start picking analogies at random, that you would get such a gender bias. Just 301 of the unique X's were female. So, and we see this gender imbalance even when we move to LLMs shortly. We also saw conservativity of domain. So if your X was a political figure, it was very likely that your Y was a political figure too. If your X was a figure from the arts, then your Y would be a figure from the arts too. Or showbiz figures were compared to showbiz figures, businessmen and women were compared to business people, crime figures were compared to crime figures. And so you can see the diagonals here. These are raw counts, that the most common domain for the Y for an X political figure was politics. So we tended to have more in-domain comparisons than out-of-domain comparisons. And we had an overwhelming gender preservation too. So a male X was compared to a male Y, a female X was compared to a female Y. Very few of what you might call trans comparisons, where a female X is compared to a male Y or vice versa. People just seem to be highly conservative when making these XYZ comparisons. They tend to stay in domain and they tend to stay in gender, which is quite interesting because there's no reason why you should. Okay, so we tend to map like to like both on domain and in gender. And this is the human data that we collected from the web. Now, speaking about conservativity, I'm giving you the impression that these are somewhat dull comparisons, but there are quite a few creative comparisons nestled amongst the bulk, right? So here's one of my favorites. Red meat is the Donald Trump of cancer. Donald Trump is an interesting figure for many reasons, but he's quite a popular Y as a comparator, but also a popular X as a target of comparison. He needs to be described, and he is a useful descriptor. He has this dual function in our data. So what does red meat is the Donald Trump of cancer actually mean? This is one of those cases where the meaning is not at all transparent, and you actually have to go to the original document to find out what the speaker means. Because to me, it's not at all clear. And if you go to the original speaker's document where they mention this XYZ, they explain that red meat is implicated in a great many different cancers in the human body. The WHO warns against it. The data is not conclusive, but by and large, people are encouraged to eat less red meat, especially less processed red meat, because it's implicated in so many different cancers. So red meat is the Donald Trump of cancer. Donald Trump here is a signifier of an aggressive builder. He is an aggressive builder all over Manhattan. See his towers with his name on it. So red meat is an aggressive builder of cancer, is essentially what this XYZ is saying, which I thought was quite a clever one. Though I don't think this guy's actually built anything in many years, but he still has this cultural significance as an aggressive builder. Another quite funny one that tickled me quite a bit was the potato is the Tom Hanks of the vegetable world, which means that the potato is very versatile, quite popular, and as ChatGPT explained it to me, very down to earth. So It's a good example of ChatGPT's humor there. So there's quite a non-trivial number of really interesting XYZs amongst the highly conservative data. By the way, most of our comparisons, as I said, were male to male, and most of them are in the political domain, which I think speaks to a certain tenor of internet web content. Okay, so that's the baseline that we have. Human data, human XYZs gathered from a large troll of web content in 2012. Now we want to see what LLM generated XYZs will look like and whether we see the same biases or not. Now, let me say up front that the focus of this work is rather narrow, and that we're looking at GPT 3.5 and GPT 4. And we really should be looking, and we will be looking at other language models to see if the generalizations that we identify here hold across models. So I'll use the term LLM when I'm really talking about this very narrow range of large models provided by OpenAI. So we prompted GPT 3.5 automatically through the API with a range of high-level domains: sport, politics, science. So these are meta-domains to generate a whole raft of XYZs. And we got 1,020 new XYZs across those very high-level categories. So the LLM was allowed to choose the X and the Y and the Z. We've simply placed it within a very broad cultural context of sport, or politics, or science, the arts, history, and so forth. We prompted the model with an example of a good XYZ, explained what an XYZ was, and then asked it to generate its own. And this is the broad characterization of the data that we get. So Elon Musk was the most popular X. It's kind of out, if you think about it. Beyonce, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Jane Goodall, Oprah Winfrey, Serena Williams. You can see a few female figures there. Ada Lovelace. The most common Y was William Shakespeare. Okay, that shows a certain lack of imagination, I think. I think we all like Shakespeare, but it's too easy to hold Shakespeare up as the epitome of talent. Steve Jobs, Picasso, Winfrey, Leonardo, Einstein again, Marilyn Monroe, J.K. Rowling. So we see a raft of female figures here too, which is encouraging. And the most common Z occurring in 21 of our XYZs. These are LLM generated XYZs, is international diplomacy. I'm going to refer to these XYZs as neutral XYZs because we did not ask the language model to skew toward or away from irony. So these are the natural XYZs that the LLM will generate when we don't indicate that we want irony or a lack of irony. And it turns out that most of them correspondingly are benign. They tend to be positive and sincere seeming descriptions of the X's in each case. Now, we are encouraged to see that the gender imbalance is addressed somewhat, but not completely. In fact, we get 2-to-1 male to female, which is better than the 9-to-1 or thereabouts that we see male to female in the human data that we gather from the web. And on the human data we gather from the web, the gender of the X and the gender of the Y is almost always identical. So we're conserving gender. And we see gender conservativity in the LLMs as well. A little less than with the human data, but still significant gender conservativity. So we're encouraged to see that there is a redress somewhat of the gender balance, but it's still 2-to-1 male to female. You'll see that there's a neutral N category as well, because in both sets of data, XYZs are sometimes used to describe things, X's that are not people. So phones, casinos. There's a casino in Las Vegas that was described as the Julia Roberts of casinos. I don't know entirely what that means. The Motorola Razr phone was described as the Kate Moss of phones, presumably because it's very thin. So you see these examples where you have non-human X's. That's the neutral category there. Now, in the human data that we gather from the web, most comparisons were in domain. Whereas in the data generated by the LLM, most comparisons, but not by a large margin, are out of domain, which is to say that the X and the Y come from broadly different domains. You have a scientist compared as a sports person or vice versa. The XYZ distinction here is that with an XYZ construct, we expect X to be closely associated with the Z domain. This is the purpose of the analogy. Donald Trump is the Einstein of diplomacy. We expect Trump and diplomacy to go together more than Einstein and diplomacy. And this distinction, or this semantic criterion, is more clearly observed in the LLM-produced output than in the human-produced output, which is interesting. And I think this is largely to do with the fact that many of the X's in the human data are what we might call unknowns. They're not famous people. And therefore, when we use a vector representation of the X's and the Y's and the Z's to calculate this, the vector representation of an unknown person, Fred Bloggs, isn't very informative. Naturally, LLMs, they have no lives. They don't live lives. They don't have personal lives or private lives. So I mean, it's obvious, but it's worth stating that all of the X's in LLM XYZs are famous. They're people that every reader or every user of GPT can be expected to know. Whereas people on the web or in everyday life, when they make an XYZ comparison, they're simply describing an X that is known to the specific addressee. Right, so you might be talking about the person who works in the local coffee shop or someone who teaches a course in your university. You're not talking about someone who's world famous. Whereas in the LLM cases, all of the X's and all of the Y's are world famous. So there's a fame decline there that we have to take into account. Okay, so how do we get the LLM to be ironic? Okay, here's an example of interacting with ChatGPT. We don't use ChatGPT, we use the API, but here's something of a reconstruction of how we get the LLM to be ironic. First off, we define where an XYZ comparison is. It has to be figurative. We give the example of Bill Gates as the Thomas Edison of the 21st century, which actually comes from our human data. Or Roger Federer is the Michael Jordan of tennis. I think both of those XYZs seem a bit dated now, but they're still very useful examples. And then we have the language model respond. Now, this response doesn't actually come from the language model. When we use the API, we pretend that the language model said this. This technique is called gaslighting, where we get the language model to believe that it said something that it didn't actually say. And I think that beds in the context more solidly. So here we have the language model talking about ironic XYZs and even giving an example of an ironic XYZ. Vladimir Putin is the Dalai Lama of world politics. So now the language model is fully primed to generate ironic XYZs. In fact, it believes it introduced the topic. So we go ahead and we say, give me 20 ironic XYZ metaphors. And we provide a very, very general meta-domain indicator here to show business. Other indicators might be contemporary life, world of sport, the arts, the sciences, medicine, popular culture, and so forth. So these are meta-domains. We don't expect these to be actual Zs, but we expect the Z values to be subclasses of this very high-level domain that we've provided. And here's what the data looks like at a high level. The most common X is Donald Trump. I think this reflects his status as a lightning rod in contemporary culture. The most common Y is Mother Teresa. To the language model, she is a saint. She is the epitome of goodness, whereas William Shakespeare is the epitome of talent. Banksy, he is the epitome of neither of those things. Banksy tends to be used in these ironic XYZs when you want to discredit an artist. You're merely the Banksy of your domain. You're the Dan Brown of your literary domain, let's say. But otherwise, lots of the Ys do look very positive. It'd be nice if it could be compared to Steve Jobs or Mozart or Dali or Buddha. It's an ambivalent pleasure to be compared to Elon Musk, I guess, or Gordon Ramsay. But we see generally, Martin Luther King, I don't think anyone would be upset to be compared to Martin Luther King. So we see everyone is famous in our data here. There's no one that stands out as being an anonymous Joe from around the corner that you might want to describe. And the most common Z, I suppose aptly, given that these are LLM generated items, is artificial intelligence, crypto. And we get the same gender balance / imbalance, 2 males for every female, if you will, which is still better than the human data by quite a lot, but it's still not ideal. Okay, so let's compare the neutral XYZs to the explicitly ironic XYZs. Now, remember, our goal here is to see whether we can trust the LLM to generate irony for us. Because irony is such a complex phenomenon. It's not enough to simply trust that the LLM has done the job well. It turns out that most of the time, it won't do the job well. And we need to have some kind of filtering criteria to identify the cases where it does what we want and to identify the cases where it hasn't done what we want, and we have to reject its response and ask it to do it again. This is how you use LLM, I believe, in an automated context. You have criteria for identifying when it's done well and when it hasn't done well. So we see that the male-female balance is the same, that, however, the gender conservativity is somewhat less. The ironic comparisons are more likely to compare a man to a woman or vice versa, which speaks to the creativity of the comparisons. They're willing to break that very simple boundary, gender boundary, that humans seem unwilling to break and which the neutral XYZs were relatively unwilling to break. We also see on the right here that the vast majority of the XYZs generated in this ironic mode are out of domain, which again speaks to the creativity of the comparisons. So X's and Y's from very different domains are paired in our XYZs. So these things, there's more of a semantic reach, and there's less conservativity, both of domain and of gender, which I think is very encouraging. And this is a general point I want to make. If you're using an LLM to get creative outputs, it is very ineffectual to say to the LLM, I want a creative output. Please be creative. Please generate a creative metaphor. It doesn't really, on current reckoning, get the meaning of the word creative. Because like the word irony on social media, it has been attenuated and bleached so much that it doesn't really mean very much to the language model. It means something to do with surprise. It means something to do with atypicality, but it doesn't really grasp what creative means. If you want to get creative outputs as reflected in, for instance, semantic distance and this breaking of conservativity, it's much better to ask for ironic outputs or cynical outputs or witty outputs. Those words have real traction with the LLM, whereas the word creative does not, unfortunately. Okay, so we now need to get criteria for identifying which of the so-called ironic outputs actually are ironic. So, and we want the LLM to do this for us. We don't want to have to bring in another big gun from somewhere else. So we're going to get the LLM to give us the criteria to sift amongst its own outputs. So one thing we can do is we ask the LLM for each XYZ to identify the dominant emotion in the comparison. It turns out that for the human XYZs, admiration is the dominant emotion. Admiration for X leads us to choose a Y that shows X in a positive light. 72% of the XYZs are labeled with the emotion admiration by the LLM. For the neutral XYZs, I'm sorry, let me go back there a moment. 72% of the human XYZs that we collect from the web are labeled as admiring. For the LLM generated XYZs in this neutral mode, 95% of them are admiring. That is, the dominant emotion is admiration. There are benign, positive, admiring comparisons. When we ask for ironic XYZs, 69% of the XYZs wear this dominant emotion, admiration. But we expect, in the case of irony, that the admiration is false admiration, which is to say that the comparison merely looks admiring, but when we look closer, we see contempt and disdain underneath. But it's interesting that on the surface, most of the XYZs in the neutral and ironic cases and in the human-generated cases are superficially admiring. When we ask the LLM to associate numbers between 0 and 100 to estimate the scale of the emotion, we ask it to measure the positivity, the believability, and the fairness of each XYZ as it perceives them. We see that for the human data, the average positivity score is 66. The average believability is 48, and the average fairness is 40. For the neutral XYZs generated by the LLM, the average positivity score is 82. The average believability is 72. So LLM was judging its own XYZs as being highly positive and highly believable. And when we ask it to judge the ironic XYZs, it gives a much lower positivity on average, 54 out of 100, a lower believability, 40 out of 100, and a lower fairness, 32 out of 100. So what's going on with irony? Can we formulate an operationalized definition of irony in this case? My operationalized definition of irony in this case is that a comparison, an XYZ comparison specifically, should be highly positive but have low believability. See, irony needs low believability. If you are so good at spinning the facts so that you can say something positive about a negative situation and people believe in your positivity, you're not being ironic. To be ironic, you have to present a false veneer of positivity, but the audience has to penetrate that false veneer and see past it. And they're not going to do that if they actually believe the false veneer. So the ideal or idealized ironic comparison has high positivity and low believability. So we can see from the numbers here that we're not seeing that. Okay, the positivity is lower and the believability is lower for the ironic outputs, but not substantially lower enough. So clearly we've got in the mix here some successful irony and some unsuccessful irony, and we need to separate the two if we're actually going to trust the LLM to do ironic outputs for us. Okay. By the way, I should say that these criteria of believability, fairness, and positivity are not. In the case of the human XYZs we gathered from the web, we see Pearson's OR correlations of 0.5, 0.6. For the neutral XYZs generated by the LLM, we see correlations of 0.4, 0.5, 0.6. And we see even stronger correlations in the ironic cases, 0.6, 0.7. These are overlapping criteria. Now, it's actually a relief to see the correlations. It means that the LLM isn't simply plucking the numbers out of the air, and it has some sense of what positivity, fairness, and believability mean if we're seeing what we expect in terms of correlations. We also see that if you were to ask for the aptness of a comparison or the sincerity of a comparison, we would get well correlated results also. And if we were to ask for the apparent incongruity of a comparison, we would get negatively correlated numbers. So this gives us faith that the LLM is able to judge these things, perhaps crudely, but in line with human expectations. Okay, so let me visualize what I mean by my idealized irony. Okay, so if we were to graph positivity against believability, here where the center of the graph is the midway point between 0 and 100 on both scales, then what we're looking for is high positivity and low believability. We want to see XYZs clustered in that upper left quadrant when we're generating irony, right? And when we're generating sincere compliments, we want to see our XYZs clustered in the upper right quadrant. Now, when we graph our data, we're going to be disappointed to see that quite a lot of the data for irony isn't in that upper left quadrant. Now, there are many theories of verbal irony. The one that I favor is by Glucksberg and Kuma Nakamura. Their pragmatic insincerity, or their illusional pretense theory. Basically, you allude to a pretend scenario, and the pretense is so transparent that people can see past it, can see your real meaning. Glucksberg refers to this phenomenon as pragmatic insincerity. Insincerity is when you lie. Pragmatic insincerity is when you lie with the point or with the intent of being seen as a liar. So you're saying something insincere in the knowledge that your insincerity is easily detected. And that's where low believability comes in. For pragmatic insincerity to take hold, we need low believability. Here's an example of an ironic XYZ generated by the LLM when we ask it to be ironic. Donald Trump is the Marie Antoinette of modern democracy. I confess I'm not entirely sure what this means. So I asked the language model, and it said that they're both prone to say inappropriate and offensive things, which I think is quite an interesting analysis. Okay, so would you say that Donald Trump is the Marie Antoinette of modern democracy is an ironic comparison? Marie Antoinette isn't a very popular figure historically. So maybe this is a sincere description of Trump. You see, lots of our examples are going to be borderline. Irony is a complex phenomenon that is not cut and dry. And getting machines to generate irony is difficult enough, but being able to discern when the machine has done the job properly is even harder. Okay, so here are some sample outputs from the LLM when we ask it to be ironic. Conor McGregor is the Mother Teresa of sportsmanship. Okay, so gave that the label admiration, but it also said that the positivity was just 10 out of 100, the believability was just 10 out of 100, the fairness was just 10 out of 100, the I label there, we actually asked it to label how likely it was to be ironic on a scale of 0 to 100, and it came up with 5 out of 100. So the language model is all over the map. It says this is an admiring comparison, but the positivity is just 10 out of 100. And the believability is just 10 out of 100. So what's going on? We see different levels of transparency for different prompts. When we ask it to label the emotion, it does so superficially, and it sees that superficially this is an admiring comparison. But when we ask it to model the positivity, it digs deeper, and it sees the positivity of the intent and not the surface. This is quite frustrating and quite interesting, that different prompts have different levels of transparency in the language model. And this will vary from language model to language model. So we need to get multiple data points and then pick amongst them to identify the truly ironic output. So Conor McGregor is the Mother Teresa of sportsmanship. Anyone who's ever seen him or heard him or been within 100 miles of him knows that this is a very unfair comparison to Mother Teresa, whatever your views of Mother Teresa. So this is irony, even though the language model says that the chance of it being irony is very low. How about McDonald's is the Marie Curie of healthy eating? Interestingly, the language model identifies the sarcasm as the dominant emotion here, and it does that in a very small number of cases. So basically, the language model is saying that the negativity is so clear here that this doesn't even count as irony. And naturally enough, it gives us a very low positivity and a very low believability score. How about Lady Gaga is the Jane Austen of understatement? Okay, well, I think that is ironic, right? I don't think Jane Austen ever went to a social engagement dressed in meat in the way Lady Gaga has been known to do. She's obviously very talented, but she's also not a model of understatement. Okay, so the language model says that this is an admiring remark. It gives it a middling positivity score and a low believability score. How about industrial agriculture is the Godzilla of the countryside? Here, the dominant emotion is anger. The positivity is very low, 20 out of 100, but the believability is quite high, 60 out of 100. So this doesn't strike me as irony. This is a creative comparison, to be sure. It's figurative, but it is not expressing a propositional attitude that is contrary to the speaker's real feelings. The speaker is angry, the comparison is angry. In my book, this does not count as irony, although it is sardonic. And you see that the language model makes a mistake, if you will, that is common amongst humans, that they mistake a sardonic or slightly cynical attitude with irony. Irony is a real phenomenon, and it's not simply an attitude of cynicism or dismay. Okay, so in these examples, we see there's a lot of complexity in the output, and we have to pick amongst those to automatically identify where the language model has genuinely given us an ironic output. Okay, if we graph the data, if we graph the positivity versus the believability of each XYZ for the human data, for the benign or neutral LLM data, for the ironic LLM data, we see a scatter like this. So for the human data, 32% of the examples are in the upper left quadrant, which we might call insincere praise. 43%, or the bulk of the data, is in the upper right, which we might call sincere praise. And 22% is in the lower left quadrant, which we might call an insincere insult. There's very little data in the bottom right quadrant, and that's because we saw earlier that believability and positivity are correlated. So that's a natural outcome of that. As we move across the scale, we're not going to get many data points in the bottom right quadrant. For the neutral XYZs generated by the LLM, they tend to be very benign, right? So 81% of them end up in the upper right quadrant, which counts as a form of sincere praise. And very few of them are in the bottom left quadrant. Not many are in the upper left quadrant in sincere praise. So we saw this earlier, that the neutral prompting for XYZs for the LLM generates mostly benign comparisons, which might be called sincere praise. You can see that the mean believability and positivity are squarely in the upper right quadrant as well. Now for the ironic outputs from the LLM, we see a different story. Sincere praise, 35%. So 35% of the XYZs are in the upper right quadrant. We don't really want them to be up there. And 35% are in the lower left quadrant, which we might call insincere insults, that is, insults that are not believable. And 28%, only 28%, are in the upper left quadrant, which we might call insincere praise. This is really what we're operationalizing as irony. So it turns out that less than a third of the outputs we would actually classify as irony, even though we've explicitly asked for irony. Now, the mean positivity and believability we find in that upper left quadrant, but the standard deviation, the variance is so high that it's not really a meaningful observation. So we see that with just over a quarter, less than a third of the outputs for the ironic request actually conforming to our idea of irony, we're going to have to reject over 70% of the data, which means that we need criteria for rejecting that 70% of the outputs if we actually want to end up with reliably ironic outputs from our LLM. Okay. Now, there is that small case, that edge case, where in a very small number of situations, the LLM identifies the XYZ as sarcastic. So we found 26 examples of the XYZs that were supposed to be ironic were labeled as sarcasm. Those were 25 of them, the mean was very tightly focused in the upper left quadrant. And one of them, for 25 of them, the mean was very tightly focused in the lower left quadrant, which we might define as the sarcasm quadrant. And only one of them, an outlier, was in the quadrant that we associate with irony. And that example was Narendra Modi is the Stephen Hawking of humility. I really don't know what to make of this comparison. I asked the language model, and it seems to believe that Modi, the Prime Minister of India, is not a very modest fellow. Right. Now, it's not to say that Stephen Hawking was immodest. I think he had a certain British modesty in his way of speaking. So I think Hawking is being used here as a somewhat Einsteinian figure, the top of his field. So again, make of it what you will. Irony is complicated. So in a very few cases, sarcasm is well identified. And you think, if the language model can identify sarcasm, why don't we simply ask the language model to identify irony? So when we use this ironicity score that I showed you earlier, where the language model associates a score between 0 and 100 with a likelihood of an XYZ being ironic, and we use that score to distinguish the outputs from the ironic prompt from the outputs of the neutral prompt, we get no discrimination value. So here I've plotted an ROC curve, a receiver operator characteristic curve, where you graph sensitivity versus specificity. So sensitivity to positive examples versus specificity, which is really a sensitivity to true negatives. So sensitivity to true positives versus sensitivity to true negatives. And random performance is denoted by the dotted line. So we can see that using the LLM's own judgment of ironicity, even for things it itself has generated, is extremely poor. It doesn't give us any substantial area under the curve, and ironicity is really no better than random choice, okay, which is kind of disappointing and kind of interesting at the same time. I mean, we're giving the LLM things it itself generated, and it can't tell us if they're ironic or not, even when we give them ironic outputs, supposedly ironic outputs. So asking the LLM directly, are you being ironic when you say this, is a pointless exercise. But when we graph or use believability as a criterion to try to separate the outputs of the benign or neutral prompt from the outputs of the ironic prompt, we get much more area under the curve. Believability is a much more discerning quality, right? So we get better separation of the ironic, supposedly ironic, and supposedly non-ironic outputs. Okay, so believability is really important to discerning irony, and luckily it seems the language model has a good grasp on that quality. Fairness. Fairness is also a quality that we associate with irony. It's highly correlated with believability. We get a little less area under the curve. It's a little less discerning than believability, but it's in the same ballpark. And when we graph all of them on this ROC curve, we see that we get the most area under the curve by a combination of believability and positivity. And this, to my eyes, is a numerical approximation of Glucksberg's concept of pragmatic insincerity. Okay, so we multiply the believability score provided by the LLM by the positivity score provided by the LLM. And this is our best criterion for separating supposedly ironic from actually not ironic outputs. We've got an irony magnet with these qualities that allows us to take the outputs of the model and to identify when they are successfully ironic, or most likely to be perceived as ironic by our intended audience, and most likely to have the meaning that we want them to have. Again, there's no point in getting the LLM to speak for us if we can't control the meaning of what it's saying for us. Okay, so we need a way of separating out the successful irony from the unsuccessful irony. Now, you'll notice that I haven't actually looked at the interpretations, the actual meanings. We're looking at somewhat superficial measures of positivity and believability. Okay, so supposing we were to ask for, remember the comparison, Donald Trump is the Einstein of diplomacy, right? Now, if we were to ask what the category was that was the abstract category into which both Donald Trump and Einstein were being placed by this comparison, and we were to prompt a language model to simply suggest what it thinks the category is, and we didn't tell the language model that the comparison was ironic, then it would come back with the category influential figures in their respective fields. See, there's a hidden abstraction in each XYZ, And to the language model, Donald Trump is the Einstein of diplomacy, is saying that both Trump and Einstein are influential figures in their respective fields. And if we then ask the language model, what is the positivity on a scale of 0 to 100 of placing someone in this category, it would give us 95. It's a very positive, benign thing to say about someone. Now, however, if we tell the language model, actually, this is an ironic comparison, and in that context, what is the abstraction behind the comparison? What is the category into which X and Y are implicitly placed by the comparison? It will say inept or unskilled diplomats. And when we ask it to rate the positivity of inclusion in that category, it gives us a score of 10. So the difference between these two perspectives, these two ratings of two different interpretations, we call the parallax. So the higher the parallax, the more successful the irony. So the parallax here is 85 points. That is the difference between the positivity of the ironic reading and the positivity of the benign reading. So this is equivalent to the downshift we were measuring earlier. And obviously, we want to see high parallax for ironic outputs. That is, the people who get the irony right differ quite substantially from the people who don't perceive the irony in terms of their interpretation. We can also talk about the downshift without going into the abstract category. So for instance, we can ask, what is the positivity of being compared to Albert Einstein? And the system will say, I give that a 90 out of 100. And what's the positivity of being called an inept or unskilled diplomat? And the system says, I give that a 10. So the difference between those two numbers we call the downshift. Right, so being compared to Einstein is great, but being called the Einstein of diplomacy when you're being ironic is not so great. And again, we measure the ironic downshift on average across all of our XYZs. And we find that we get some surprising results. For the human XYZs, we see quite a strong parallax. Okay, so we get a parallax of about 25% on average, and a downshift of 8% on average. For the neutral XYZs generated by the neutral prompt, the LLM, we get an average parallax of 18% and a downshift of 8%. And for the ironic XYZs, the parallax is only 15%. What this is telling us is that the human XYZs we gathered from the web and the XYZs that were generated with the neutral prompt have a capacity to be viewed ironically. They have a capacity to be viewed ironically. That doesn't mean that they will be viewed ironically. But when we ask the model to view them ironically, we perceive this downshift in sentiment and this parallax of interpretations. We see less of this with the ironic outputs, but the ironic outputs are more likely to be perceived from the ironic perspective because their believability is low. So what we see with the other data sets is that, yes, if you choose to see them ironically, you will get the parallax, but you don't have a reason to view them ironically because their believability is high. You get a bit less of a parallax on average for the ironic data, but the believability is much lower for the ironic data. So you're much more likely to look for the parallax and get it. So the end story, the takeaway is believability remains absolutely crucial. This ability of the LLM to rate the believability of a comparison is absolutely crucial to our ability to sort its successful ironic production from its unsuccessful ironic production. By the way, just in passing, downshift and parallax, as you might expect, are highly correlated because they overlap in how they're calculated. Just to put that out there. Okay, so I will conclude by saying that irony stirs external debate, but it requires an internal dialogue. You cannot simply take a statement as ironic at face value and say, okay, that was a success. You have to interrogate it. You have to look at it from multiple different angles. You have to quantify it from multiple perspectives. And you have to sort amongst those quantifications to find out whether your supposedly ironic utterance meets your operationalized definition of the ideal ironic utterance. And when it does, you keep it and you treat it as a success. But when it doesn't, you discard it and you ask the language model again, try again, do it again, and you keep doing that until you get what it is that you're looking for. And this is absolutely vital with language models, that if you're going to use them in an automated setting to speak for you, you need to put very tight criteria in place, guardrails, if you will, to make sure that what it's saying conforms to your intent. Okay, so I'll use a generalization from Dan Kahneman to finish. If you've read Thinking Fast and Slow or the work of Kahneman and Tversky, you know that there's this caricature of the human mind where we're actually two different systems, system one and system two. System one is superficial. It's driven by cliche and stereotypes and experience. It's reactive. It jumps to conclusions. It's always on. It really conforms to what we call intuition. It's very helpful when it's right, but sometimes it leads us astray and allows us to make dumb decisions. System two is our analytical capacity, our ability to reason, to dig deeper, to seek out explanations, to look for logical through lines. It is slow. It is not always on. It has to be, and is easily depleted. It is mentally tiring to use system two. But when we do, we can be more sure of the results. So I like to think of language models as really a computational model of system one. Okay, which means that when they work, they're great, and when they don't work, they're far from great. And what we really need computationally is a system two to encompass system one, to filter and funnel and channel the results to get what we want. And what I've described in this talk with these various statistical probes is a way, in the case of irony, of building a system to select from system one when we can guarantee or assure that system one has done the right thing, and to discard from system one when we believe it has done the wrong thing. Okay, thank you for your patience. Hopefully you have questions I can help you with. Thanks again.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you. Thank you. This was very, very interesting and full of inputs and stimuli and ideas and prompts. I'm sure, yeah, I see many clapping hands. I'm sure there will be also comments and questions from people.
Yes, feel free to email me if you don't have a question right now, but something occurs to you later on in the afternoon.
Exactly. Also, the talk is recorded, so we will post it on the Abstraction website. And so if questions don't arise immediately now, maybe people can watch again and think of better questions. It was very impressive, the amount of work that you presented. I found it very, very interesting, and I saw many connections with abstraction mechanisms, of course. And among them, in these XYZ structures, the Y, as you explained in the beginning, the Y is, in the way you operationalize it, is an individual that stands for a category. So it's a... Yes. Yeah, and yeah, that was very, very interesting as a generalization mechanism. So Putin is the Dalai Lama of politics. The Dalai Lama is an individual that stands for a category of calm and pacific people. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether you checked or whether you have in your data the properties on which the model retrieved the whys. So
Well,
it has to.
you can ask the language model to give you the properties, but you can never. That's a post facto confabulation, and you're never sure of what criteria it uses. I mean, you can use probes if you get in under the hood of the language model, smaller language models perhaps. But you can ask the language model for insight and interpretation. But again, it's an invented conversation. And every time you go back to a language model, you're effectively talking to a different person, if you will. They're putting themselves in the same position, but I mean, we see this when it generates irony and then you ask it to rate the ironicity, it says it's very, very low. But you just told me it was ironic, right? So this idea, by the way, that the Y is an individual that stands for a category, this is an embodiment, no, it's an instantiation of Glucksberg's category inclusion theory of metaphor, which I think is the best theory of metaphor. Basically, Glucksberg and McGlone, in their 2001 book, they say that when you say, my job is a jail, you're not really saying my job is a jail. I don't work in a jailhouse, or I'm not a prisoner making mailbags and license plates. It's simply that jail is representative of a broader category into which it and my job fall. It's a placeholder for something that cannot be named because it's a bit too diffuse. So there's the category of oppressive, fearful, unpleasant workspaces and living spaces. And jail is somehow very representative of that, very salient in the Andrew Orton sense of salient and balance. And we're also putting my job into that place too. So you're not saying that my job is a jail, you're saying they belong to the same category of which jail is highly representative. And so you're not saying that Donald Trump is Einstein or Putin is the Dalai Lama, you're saying I'm putting them into the category that one would think these things belong to. But finding out what that category is, that abstraction, is left up to you, and there's a certain variability there. But readers, you'd expect, would get to the same category. Otherwise, the XYZ isn't a useful communication device.
Thank you. Are there any comments and questions from home? I see Anna Sofia Lippolis. Please go ahead.
Yes, Lippolis. Hi. Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I'm a PhD student and I work on the AI-assisted discovery and generation of metaphors. And I wanted to follow up on the previous question because I was wondering that maybe for explainability, one thing that I found it interesting to use is using a knowledge base or a knowledge graph injection approach to the LLM to have some explainability on what the things, what it's picking up on. And this also increases creativity because I was wondering in this case, we have many like public figures, but maybe if we took a lot of, I don't know, knowledge from, let's say, Wikipedia or Wikidata, also about fictional characters, for example, Mickey Mouse. I mean, this happens in everyday life, like we talk about it, but maybe for the LLM, like it has some fixed ways of producing figurative knowledge that may be a bit repetitive and less creative, of course, than what humans would do. So I was wondering if like using some sort of knowledge bases could help us in maybe improving some outputs.
Right. It's interesting that the knowledge bases that you would immediately think about using are already in the training data for the language model. So it's already been trained on Wikipedia, for instance. So we don't strictly need to inject outside knowledge, but we can have a prior conversation with the language model where we make it focus on that knowledge. And then when that is part of the context, we ask it to generate the metaphor or the analogy, and then that will feed into the analogy. So for instance, anything that you might get from the Wikipedia knowledge graph is already in the language model. But we can, through contextual priming, say, give me 10 interesting facts about X. And then you'll get your 10th fact: born in Slovakia, trained as a baker, likes hang gliding, whatever. They all then feed into the context. And when you generate your output, you have the context that was used to generate it. So you have a very informed utterance. So I would agree with you, except with the part of actually doing the injection. I would replace the injection part with a prior prompting part. Now, I teach a course on semantic web and knowledge graphs. And everything has to become language model based now for it to remain relevant to students. So I give them several lectures on building knowledge graphs with LLMs. So the content to build the knowledge graph is already in the LLM. And it turns out that, for instance, the GPT models are quite good at generating OWL content. And you can have that in the context. So that's all by way of saying that, yes, the knowledge graph idea is really good. It focuses the attention of the model on salient facts that we want to control, but the facts are already in the language model. It's just a question of bringing them into the context. You can bring them into the context with injection and RAG, or you can bring them into the context with prior prompting.
Thank you. Yeah, I just, what I was also saying is that putting a structure way, so telling the LLM how to use that structure, for example, for the metaphor, for the Glucksberg theory, could be find me a key concept underlying the metaphor. When I say your hair is golden, it means that they are yellow and they are blonde and gold is yellow. Or like giving that sort of structure maybe could help. And I was also wondering about the fact that sometimes on the internet or online knowledge bases, especially for figurative knowledge, there are no like domain maybe specific or like things that are not online. For example, for metaphors, there are like no data set on like scientific metaphors or like climate change metaphors and the likes. So LLMs can find like good metaphors for known data sets, but other kinds of metaphors are really like not really detected. So I was wondering also like that curated human knowledge graphs or knowledge bases, maybe they could help in some specific fields. For example, I want to use irony in a specific context. I want to generate it in a specific context. Like I was wondering if that could be helpful. Like if we need more crowdsourced or like human curated knowledge, or what we have is already enough, because of course everything on the web is a lot already.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting challenge because when we ask the LLM to generate a metaphor for us or some kind of creative utterance, that's not our only requirement. We actually, if you think about the context in which you want an LLM to generate a creative output for us, it's an output that we want to use. So it has to be useful for us. And that's the very definition of creativity. Creativity, as it's generally operationalized, is novel plus useful, right? And usefulness is specific to our needs. So if I want to say something about a topic that makes the topic appear more positive or more negative, more friendly, less friendly, then I would want my metaphor to do that task for me. So it's not enough to simply say, hey, generate a metaphor, and whatever you give me, I'll use it. No, you say, give me a metaphor that serves this purpose, and if it serves this purpose, I will use it. So there are two tasks there. One is, how do you specify to the LLM what your purpose is? And two, how do you detect, if you're not simply a human in the loop, that the LLM has served your purpose? Okay, so I spoke a great deal about automatically checking to see that the LLM did generate an ironic output. But part of your question is, how do you tell the language model what it is you want to do, and how do you focus its energies on a particular strategy or on a particular explainable approach to metaphor? So yes, if you have a knowledge graph, you can prompt the language model with contents from the knowledge graph to say, I want you to focus your efforts on this part of the target domain. If it's quantum mechanics, I want you to focus on its superposition capabilities, or I want you to focus on the inherent mysteriousness of quantum mechanics, or on its non-classical properties. So that's part of the prompt. And then afterwards, you have to check that it did that properly. Now, a really clever way of doing this, and probably overusing the word clever, because it's quite obvious really, is the chain of thought approach. So instead of telling the language model, please generate a metaphor for me about this target concept, you actually give it a multi-step algorithm as a prompt. And that algorithm goes through the steps that you just mentioned. Please identify part of the target that is deserving of attention. Please make sure that this thing is novel and salient, and please do this, and please do that, and then do this, and then do that, and then put the result together, and then give me the end result. And you can control the language model and what it does by giving it a system 2 algorithm. You see, if you don't give it a system 2 algorithm in the form of chain of thought, you're really asking its system 1 to do the work for you. So chain of thought is really a way of getting a language model to have a system 2. And I think that's what you're looking for when you want to generate metaphors that are somehow controllable and that suit your specific needs.
Thank you. Is there a last quick question? I don't see any hands. So thank you again, Tony, for the wonderful seminar, for the wonderful talk. And thank you, everybody, for taking part. And I will now close the call and the recording, and see you at the next seminar organized by Abstraction.